So, Berto, have you noticed in the news and in people talking that they sometimes will talk about everyone who's mentally ill is going to commit a crime or violent crime or something? Have you ever encountered this notion in our society?
Oh, yes. I mean, ever since I can remember, more so when I noticed it even more when I was part of the problem, I guess, because growing up, even though my dad was a psychiatrist, even though I was around terminology and things, I think just instinctually, everything on TV, movies, common conversation, if you hear the words like, oh, mentally unstable, mentally ill, mentally challenged, whatever, there were these associations with like, uh-oh, that could be bad news. Are they going to stab someone? Are they going to go crazy? Are they going to commit, are they going to hit someone? Are they? And I think movies and shows show that a lot.
Like what kind of movies? What kind of
well,
shows?
like I'm thinking of like crime shows or maybe, I don't, actually now that I think about it, maybe it was more a phenomenon like in the 80s and the 90s, but I remember one perennial example was Of Mice and Men. And I remember reading the book and watching it in sophomore year of high school. And, Lenny was slow, and so of course he killed. And it's like, well, that makes sense because he is mentally handicapped. So of course he's probably super strong and can kill easily and doesn't know his own strength and doesn't know the real, consequences of his actions. So that makes sense, right? And
right.
I was like,
I attribute it to something that I read years and years ago that really made a lot of sense to me regarding human nature. And that is that when we walk around in the world, we see all these different humans walking around. Some of them we know well, and some of them we don't know well.
right.
And so how do we gauge whether or not someone is a danger to us, particularly people that we don't know very well? How do we know when they are a threat? How do we know when they are going to hurt us? Because they're capable of hurting us. They could have a knife or a gun, or they could embezzle money from us or something.
That's right.
And so one of the ways that we shortcut that system of trying instead of sitting down with the person for 5 months and getting to know them, we do a very quick scan of the person's demeanor and behavior and presentation as a way of shortcutting to find out, is this person normal?
Yeah.
Because if they're normal, then they're like me because I'm normal.
Right.
And so if they look normal and act normal and talk normal, they must be just like me in my head because I'm normal and I dress normal.
Yeah. So you kind of like project yourself and you're like, oh, well, that's good. We're good.
I can relate to that person. Therefore, they have all the same thoughts that I do and all the same altruistic notions and stuff. But if there's anything off about another human being, then all bets are off. I have no basis of understanding that person if they present in a way that is that is a way that I can't understand, a way that I can't predict what they're going to do next.
Right.
So if you walk down the street and you just like twirl like, I don't know, a scarf above your head, you're just walking down the sidewalk, people's heart rates will go up. Not because they care about a scarf.
True. That's true.
But they're just like, well, what's that guy doing?
What's happening here?
What's that guy doing? He's not acting normal.
Yeah.
Therefore, he could kill me is sort of the amygdala response.
And there are associations I think many of us have. For example, even recently I was downtown Seattle. I was meeting someone and there was a person there that, I don't know if they were homeless or not, but they appeared somewhat ragged and they were yelling at the street. And when you see that, it is natural, I think, to be like, whoa, maybe I should be careful here.
Right, because one, they're being aggressive.
Right.
And two, because if you don't understand what something is, again, it gets down to this base level of like, if I can't understand that person pretty quickly on a quick scan, then I can't predict anything they're going to do, which means anything is possible, which means they could kill me.
Yeah.
Now, of course, you realize the distortion involved in this is that perfectly normal looking, normal acting, normal talking people can kill you.
Right.
And frequently violent crimes are committed by people like that. But I think that's part of it. But anyway, that's what I want to talk about today is, are people who suffer from mental illness more likely to commit a crime or a violent crime than people who do not suffer from a mental illness? let's talk about that today, Berto.
Sounds fascinating.
This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a licensed therapist and a professor. Who are you, Berto?
My name is Humberto Castaneda. I hunt Yu-Gi-Oh for a living.
So that's a little backwards, isn't it?
Why?
Because, aren't you supposed to hunt Pokemon?
What's Pokemon? That's old, man.
Yeah. So this is a common thing that people ask about, and I hear it's a common thing that I hear people talk about in the news. And until I did a deep dive this week, I had a pretty elementary understanding of this whole thing. Because early in my career, I was talking with Bob. You know Bob, right?
Yeah.
Bob's been on the podcast. And I can't remember what I said, but we were in our 20s, and I said something along the lines of intimating that someone with a mental illness was more likely to be violent. I can't remember what I said. It was just in conversation. And he said, whoa, 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 whoa.
Oh, he corrected.
People with mental illness are not more likely to be violent. In fact, that's a massive misconception. You really slapped me across the face with it. And I was like, because as a marriage and family therapist, I have had very limited experience working with people with what we would call serious mental illness, which we'll get into it in a second. And so in a lot of ways, I'm particularly early career was no better than a layperson when it came to schizophrenia or something.
Well, I mean, you were asking me about TV and movies, and the common association through most growing up, every time there would be some sort of deranged killer, it's like, oh, if they have multiple personality disorder, you can bet at least one of them is a murderous psycho. Right. If they're a schizophrenic or if they're depressed, they're at least going to kill themselves, if not others. If they are kleptomaniacs, they're the bad guys in the movie. If they're, so every sort of, like you were saying, if it was not normal, it meant crime or evil.
Right. How many police officers suffered from a mental illness?
Right.
Do you know? How many good guys suffer from schizophrenia?
Yeah.
I mean, occasionally it happens, but it's pretty rare. And to go a little deeper on the movie portrayals, the craziness that they often portray in these movies are actually nothing discernible in mental illness. Like the Joker in the most recent Batman movies. Actually, it was not the most recent Batman movies.
The old ones, yeah.
The Christopher Nolan movies. Heath Ledger's character, what mental illness did he suffer from? It's not discernible.
OCD?
It's just like someone who acts weird and dresses weird and has a lot of weird affectations. That's the definition of someone who's crazy because they like to smile and laugh a lot. It's like there's no DSM diagnosis or presentation that represents.
If only if it were that obvious in real life.
Yeah. Right? Or so happy, you know what
Imagine if bad guys, when you saw a bad guy, it was always like, hello, Kirk.
So that's another thing, and then hello, Clarice, you have
hello, Clarice.
What's his Hannibal Lecter, his the way he acted was crazy.
Yeah. Well, and that one was interesting because it showed that even just psychiatrists or psychologists are probably somewhere on the criminal spectrum because they're already dealing with mental stuff.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's really just quite silly, and it affects the way that we view things. And whenever there's a killing spree that we hear about in the news, it's always like, okay, well, what mental illness did he have? And he must have a mental illness. The guy who ran over the people in Charlottesville, he must have a mental illness. It's always this assumption because again, it's another sort of reverse notion of what I was talking about earlier is that person did something so far beyond what I would do.
Right.
They must be mentally ill. They can't possibly be normal because and one of our only demarcation lines and categorization lines regarding what's not normal is someone who has a mental illness. If you're not normal, then you must have a mental illness. There's your dichotomy. You're either normal or someone who has a mental illness.
That is true. I think the lay perception is, or at least desire, maybe even, if you commit a crime, especially a violent crime, that's considered sort of not normal, in quotes, right? Therefore, something must be wrong with your mind. And, technically, it's certainly not fitting some bell curve, but it's not categorized necessarily as some mental illness.
No. Someone who has all the average issues that everyone else has and doesn't even have a mental disorder, doesn't qualify for anything, can absolutely commit a crime based on just their own motivations.
Right.
I mean, let's just take the guy in Charlottesville. I haven't looked into his background or anything.
Yeah.
But you take someone who is upset about the world, who's been fed a lot of propaganda, who is isolated and maybe doesn't have a lot of friends and is not feeling very good about his life and just at a bad point in his life.
Yeah.
And he's not depressed.
Right.
He's upset, but he's not depressed. He's not anxious. He's isolated, and he is being fed information to make him scared of a particular social movement, but he's not diagnosable. And people like that will do bad things.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily at all the result of some mental illness. Now, maybe he does suffer. Do you know if he does suffer?
I don't know.
Yeah.
By the way, this is why I love Star Wars.
Yeah.
Star Wars dispels all these notions.
Yeah.
Because think about it. The main bad guys, Darth Vader and the Emperor, they are not mentally ill. They're not portrayed as mentally ill. They're quite cogent. They speak fluently. They're very,
The Emperor comes across as like one of those like
what?
He's not. There's no discernible mental illness, but he comes
No.
across as like there's something wrong with
Oh,
with
well,
that
I mean,
guy.
he's a little touched maybe, but touched by evil. But let's take Darth Vader. Darth Vader seems very calculating, very put together, all these things. But the crazy one in the story is Luke Skywalker, who sees all these visions in his eyes that are not really there. He's the psychotic one, and yet he's the good guy.
Yeah, interesting.
So, it appends the notions.
Yeah, well, you managed to get your Star Wars quota for the episode, so to bother those people who hate Star Wars. Okay, so let's get into the research. But before we do that, let's look at what do we mean by mental illness. So what do you think we mean by serious mental illness or even mental illness in general?
Well, I guess something that is actually diagnosable based on DSM criteria, that is something that affects the person's life in a significant way and has like very specific markers that you can diagnose and things like that.
Yeah, no, I'll say that it was a good shot, but that's not what the consensus is. The bottom line is there is no official definition of what is considered a serious mental illness or even a mental illness. We have mental disorders in the DSM. They're all disorders, but they're not. And you could sort of extrapolate and say, well, they're all mental illnesses, but there's no official. These are the mental illnesses. Like there's no phrase in the DSM that says mental illness or serious mental illness. But
so it was a trick question.
It was a trick question.
You barrowed that one.
Well, what you basically defined was mental disorders.
Mental disorders.
Yeah,
okay.
all the DSM disorders. And it should be noted that in the DSM, you have things like ADHD and adjustment disorders and tic disorders and panic disorders and depression and mild depression and of course, schizophrenia and personality disorders and conduct disorders. And, it's a very thick, it's got, I don't know, 800, 900 pages and a very small print. And so it's got a lot in there. But the general consensus in the literature, which can vary, is that serious mental illness refers to things like any of the psychotic flavors. So you have schizophrenia, major depression as it gets into the because you can become psychotic in major depression,
right?
Or major depression in such a way that you can't even leave the house. You're basically in a room staring at the wall in this almost comatose state.
Yikes.
So it's not depressed like I'm sad or I'm feeling a little down. It's like the severe end of depression. The kind of major depression that today they still use electroconvulsive therapy.
Wow.
Upper end bipolar, schizoaffective, all the different kind of psychotic disorders.
So if you send a frowny face in a text, that doesn't qualify.
What are you saying?
For depression or something.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Add that with the poop emoji. Now we're talking. Yeah. Sometimes dissociative identity disorder is considered a serious mental illness. Sometimes cluster Bs, like borderline, are considered serious mental illness. But usually, serious mental illness refers to psychosis. So we're talking schizophrenia, bipolar, schizoaffective, these kinds of things.
The kind of stuff my stepdad worked with, probably, although those were violent on top of everything.
Right, which we'll get into in a second. Well, so by definition, if you have a so-called serious mental illness, which is not a clinical term, you would have what we would call non-serious mental illnesses, right? So you'd have moderate anxiety or any anxiety, I suppose, adjustment disorders, maybe PTSD, that kind of stuff.
Right.
Now, to be clear, again, these are very strange categories. Serious mental illness, to me, I wish they would just say like moderate to severe psychosis or something, or conditions that result in a break from reality or something.
Right.
Because serious mental illness, I think to many people, they wouldn't know the demarcation line. They might think that OCD is considered a serious mental illness.
Right.
And maybe for some people it is considered a serious mental illness.
Yeah, like what makes up serious moonlight, for example?
Right. Yeah. Or serious Birdo, like
That's impossible. That's an impossibility.
And also the research kind of jumps around and the media jumps around. But anyway, so that should be, but as we move forward, mainly what this talk is about moderate to severe psychotic disorders, schizophrenia mainly, honestly. Okay. So again, a couple other caveats that need to be discussed up front. Is it tough or bluff, Berto? People with mental disorders are rare.
Well, that's bluff because disorder, you said disorders, and since there's so many and so many different little categorizations, I'm going to go bluff.
True. You're right. What percentage of people in any given year in the United States qualify for a disorder in the DSM?
I'm going to say 30%.
Good, close, 25.
Really? Wow.
25%. And what percentage of people in the U.S. will qualify for a disorder at some point in their life?
In their life? Oh, in the U.S.?
In the U.S.
Okay, that should be higher. So 40%.
Good, 50%.
50? Half?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So if people with a mental disorder were at risk of violent behavior, then at any given time there would be 202, like about 150 million Americans prone to violence,
right?
And then we'd all be dead within 24 hours, right? So this notion that mental disorders leads to violence is ridiculous on its face, just when you consider the prevalence rates of mental disorders in general.
Yeah.
Okay, so tough or bluff, Berto. Violent crime is on the rise. I know you know the answer to this one.
It's bluff. We have a decrease.
Yeah. The fact is that violent crime in the United States has fallen sharply over the past 25 years. Research also shows that people think it's the opposite. So when they actually ask people, the vast majority of Americans are like, oh, no, crime's on the rise. Violence is on the rise.
Yeah, if I didn't know the stat, my gut, based on, because I think we've talked about this before. I think the social media aspect of it and the fact that we have so much access to information makes it so that it used to be that in the evening news we'd hear about a robbery or a thing. But now, like on the evening every second, it's like, oh, another murderer, another thing, another attack, another thing, nuclear war, blah, blah. So you're like, oh, shit, the world's going to hell.
I think that's excellent speculation. I would extrapolate it to media going back before the internet, too, though, because in the 70s, when we were growing up, I remember people being quite convinced, and actually violent crime was on the rise back then. But the point is that as media, even TV, even the 6 o'clock news would make people really paranoid. But anyway, media, if it bleeds, it leads. It's a common thing. Yeah. And we're also extremely bad at understanding statistics. So even you people out there who are listening to this, you will hear me say this, and you've probably heard it from others, but I give you another month of exposure to the world, and you will return. You'll have a likelihood of returning to the notion like, no, crime's on the world. The world is getting worse. And because you can't hold on to statistics,
right?
And you will go off of your gut.
It's like when I left Bogota in 1990. if you were to go by the evening news, you'd think there were like 10 bombs going off daily, but really it was only like 9.
Yeah. And, this is why I don't watch the news or CNN or any of those kinds of news shows, because I'm a human being and prone to the same foibles that everyone else is. And I will become convinced that the world is a really scary, terrible place. Yeah. And it's so interesting that when I cut myself off from those news outlets, that suddenly I feel completely at ease with the world and my neighborhood and the people around me. And lo and behold, my notions always turn out true. Literally, no one's attacked me in my entire life, I think. And so now I'm lucky and I live in particular neighborhoods. But the point is that if you're an average American, you live in a relatively safe place, and the chance that someone is going to jump out of the bushes and kill you, or a Muslim is going to bomb you, or the norovirus is going to kill you, or the chance that these things are happening are extremely low statistically, to the point of almost It's like saying, I bought a lottery ticket, I'm going to win the lottery. It's like, no, you're not. Statistically, it's if there are ever a close number, 0.000001 that's really close to zero, you have a 0% chance. Yeah. And all these things are true as well. Anyway, so that's why I don't watch the news, because it actually really makes me scared, because it's perfectly designed to scare you. That's how they keep you watching, and that's why I consider it to be the most manipulative thing humans have ever created, more manipulative than politicians. All right, so actual research. There's a lot of research into this. Does that surprise you at all in terms of does having a mental illness increase your risk of committing a violent crime?
It doesn't surprise me that there's a lot of research, both because I think that researchers might start with a certain bias of like, oh, I bet you there is, and or you would think it would be very useful because if you could predict future violent behavior based on mental diagnoses, that could be very useful.
Yeah, good. So they've looked at it from a lot of angles, and I will give you the gestalt of hundreds of research studies and meta studies that I've looked at. Well, let me ask you, what do you think? Do you think there's an association between serious mental illness like schizophrenia and violence? In other words, if you have someone with schizophrenia, are they more likely to commit a violent crime than someone who does not have schizophrenia?
I mean, my gut would tell me, yeah, probably, because of everything we've already discussed. But I'm actually going to go with bluff or no, because what I'm thinking is a lot of serious mental illness is more incapacitating in some ways than it is empowering to commit violence. Yeah. Meaning, like, it's hard for you to daily, like, to get along with others, and that might be very frustrating. You might isolate yourself. You might have a lot of issues performing well at work and all these kind of things. But I don't think that all adds up to, like, you're always, like, looking for a weapon ready to kill or something.
Yeah, although that's true, you're wrong. Unfortunately, according to research, there appears to be a relationship between serious mental illness and violent behavior.
Oh.
Yeah, and this is something you're not going to hear from a lot of people in my industry, because all of us, for the most part, are very sensitive to creating stigma around mental illness. And so we're going to go more into this later and provide a lot of caveats and a lot of broader understanding of what this means. But when you look at the actual research and several studies, you actually do see a fairly significant increase in the risk of violent behavior if you have a serious mental illness.
And do their eyes actually turn into little spirals then?
Yeah. Woo. Okay. So I'm going to give you a typical presentation, and this, Berto, you might be able to relate to, given your stepfather's involvement in a state hospital here in Washington State. So a typical presentation is someone is in their early 20s and they start to develop schizophrenia. And at first they seem depressed. They withdraw, they isolate, they quit their job, they move back in with their parents, they don't leave their room very often, they start getting a little dirty. people, friends and family are saying they seem different. They seem like something's different about them, or maybe they're sad. They might enter outpatient treatment because of the depression and or anxiety, but it doesn't seem to help, and things seems to be getting worse. The family starts to get concerned. The patient starts to develop psychosis, but at this point they're so isolated, no one really notices. They start hearing voices that are telling them that they are an evil person. That's just one of the horrible things about schizophrenia is, why do the voices have to say so many horrible things? Like, it's one thing to have auditory hallucinations. It's another thing when it's, you're a terrible person. What you just said was stupid. You will never amount to anything. No one likes you. You're a joke. And there's often swearing involved in the voices, which is interesting. Anyway, so that starts to happen.
Quick question. Have they found, is there some, research that shows that schizophrenia usually affects the same brain areas, or? Yeah,
yes and no. One, in general, we don't understand the brain in a nutshell. But yeah, there's some initial research demonstrating that there seems to be some connections with some part of the brain. Well, I heard a theory from a neuro person that made some sense, that schizophrenia might be a sort of like early Alzheimer's, in a sense, where your brain starts to break down in some ways. There are pathways in the brain that lose their function and somehow. And one of the functions of the brain is the ability to differentiate between an inner voice and an outer voice. It's something that you don't think about, but the fact that we can tell ourselves a sentence, like in our heads, we can say, boy, that was stupid what I just said the other day. And you feel yourself saying it in your head, and then there's a person saying something in your head and another you listening to that.
And you're not confused usually about
right.
Happening.
It's like, that's a voice that I am evoking in my mind, but it's not another voice. It's my voice that I have control over.
Right.
Even if the voice is intrusive, like you're not like, today I'm gonna talk shit about myself in my head. You know what I mean? It's like it just sort of pops in your head like, oh my God, that was so dumb that I said that. It still feels like a part of you, and it's still perceived as though you have at least some control over it.
I think if you could somehow output all the little micro voices that happen when we're thinking and looking and analyzing the world, it would be quite terrifying to us and others.
Right.
You'd be like, oh, I should kill that person. Oh, I don't want to. I should stab someone. I was like, oh, I'm going to. Like, it's horrible, right?
I think you just revealed something about yourself.
Well, not me. Not me.
But yeah, you're right. So, because we're apes, and we have a lot of, we're not rational beings. We're animals, and we have all these threat reactions and all these shame reactions, and we manage to control them with our superego over time, but they're still there. And so one hypothesis that sounds compelling to me is that the part of the brain that can differentiate that actually becomes dysfunctional to the point where these voices feel like outside voices, as if someone is in the room telling you something. And so the reason why they often become negative is because, again, the hypothesis goes is that a lot of us have intrusive negative thoughts about ourselves because of internalized critical voices, or just the natural tendency to feel stupid about yourself sometimes,
Like the witch voice.
Which voice?
The one that we all hear that does sound like an outside voice that tells us to kill bunnies, and that voice.
That voice, exactly, yeah. So anyway, getting back to our typical scenario, so this person has isolated themselves. They are developing psychosis, but they're pretty isolated, and no one really knows, and they're ashamed of it, so they don't tell anybody about it. The voices are being very hurtful to them and very mean to them. The voices tell them that other people are out to get them. They start to develop some paranoia. Maybe the government is after them. Maybe their father is secretly poisoning them or something. It's a lot of persecutory kinds of paranoia. notions start to intrude and they become very convinced of them. They're not just like, I wonder if my dad's poisoning. It's like, no, my dad is absolutely poisoning me. The voices tell them that they should probably do. So sometimes the voices will say, go out and kill those people. But sometimes it's almost like like if you believe that your dad is poisoning you, then it makes sense that killing him would come to mind, right? You'd be like, well, if he's going to try to kill me, it's me or him. I'm going to kill him first.
Yeah.
So sometimes people think like schizophrenia leads to voices that compel you to do something, but a lot of times it's a logical result of a psychotic notion, like the government is secretly watching me and they're screwing with me and they're purposely trying to make me go crazy. Well, and I can identify those people when I walk around in public as that person is by the government, that person is with the government, and so screw that noise. I'm going to kill those people. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And that doesn't become the dog told me to do it. It's rather, well, they're trying to kill me. Right. They're actually trying to kill me.
Exactly. Yeah.
Did you ever watch Love Actually?
No.
Oh, okay. There's one character in that movie that I feel might have something like schizophrenia, but he's someone's brother, and she goes to visit him, and he just seems like somewhat divorced from reality often, and then he'll have these moments of like he's fine, and then all of a sudden he's like trying to attack her because like she seems like but who knows what he actually has. They never talk about his diagnoses or anything. Yeah,
people can act like that for sure. So they start hearing voices, or they start having logical thoughts based on psychosis to harm other people. They don't feel great about it. Because they have compassion. People with schizophrenia generally have compassion and empathy for other people. So they're not like, let's go kill people or something. This is a presentation of someone with psychosis that leads to violence. Which we'll get into later, most people with psychosis don't end up down this road that I'm going down in a second. This is actually a rare presentation at the end. But it's an example of how one would consider schizophrenia leading to violence, so to speak. They commit a violent act. Maybe they believe the 7-Eleven cashier is a government agent, and they punch, they go behind the counter and they push him down and they say like, tell Trump to stay out of my life or something. And then, but actually, and it's usually not murder, by the way, it's usually some kind of assault or something. And actually I should back up and say that it's actually usually on a family member. The vast majority of psychotic individuals who commit violent acts, something like 85% of the acts are actually on someone in their family. Because by then they've isolated to the point where they're probably dependent on their parents.
Oh, sure.
And so a lot of times it's a parent that they actually will assault because their parents become frustrating individuals to them, so to speak, or wrapped up in their delusions. And so they often will attack their parents.
Or I'm imagining an orderly, for example.
Right. Yeah. Well, by that point, they're actually diagnosed. The profile I'm giving right now is actually purposeful in that they're not in treatment yet, because most people with psychosis who commit a violent crime are not in treatment.
I see.
So the family member gets assaulted. They don't call the police because they don't want to involve the legal system because they're afraid for their family member. They don't want.
They'll take them away or something.
Yeah. The situation continues. The situation escalates. The person suffering from schizophrenia begins to have delusions that their family is out to get them. And the person with schizophrenia commits more acts of violence. And eventually the police are involved. Eventually it gets to a certain point where the family is like, well, we got to call the cops. Or the neighbors find out. Or they go to 7-Eleven and they assault someone there.
At what point do they fall in the vat of acid?
And then they have like a smile.
Yeah.
That's earlier, of course. They commit more acts of violence. Eventually, the police are involved. The person gets convicted, and then they're evaluated because it's determined by someone in the system, either talking to the family. It's like, oh, maybe there's a mental issue here. The evaluating psychologist determines that the person is indeed suffering from mental illness like schizophrenia. At that point, they're put in a state hospital involuntarily. Instead of going to prison, it's determined, why would we send this person to prison? when they have a clear psychotic disorder, one, they're not going to do well in prison if they're psychotic, right? So they need to go somewhere else. Two, the idea of incarceration is one of rehab, and they're not going to rehab them in prisons. Now, having said that, only certain mental illnesses get deemed as hospitalizable disorders. There's plenty of people with PTSD that end up going to prisons and not to a mental institution, So anyway, so they go to a state hospital, which is the big one was where your stepfather worked.
Yeah.
And one time a patient arrived at your door.
Oh, that was when I was I believe I was still in high school or early college, but back at home or something.
Somehow they escaped.
It was a lady. She, in the middle of the night, escaped or something. And all we know is banging on the door starts at like 3 a.m. in the morning. And she was yelling things that were, incomprehensible to us, but it was demanding something or whatever. And yeah, she was from there. But over the years, she got attacked multiple times. And
yeah, people who work in facilities like that are saints. I would not want to work in a facility like that. It's very hard work and it's dangerous.
He just retired.
Oh, well, good for him. He survived.
He did.
So now they go to the hospital. They start getting treatment, maybe the medication, and then as they are in the hospital, they're periodically evaluated to see if they're a risk to others or themselves. And then at some point, years down the line or so, or depending on how serious the crime was, honestly, and depending on the course of their psychosis, they might be deemed as okay to be released, and then they're released. So that's one story. Now, that is not a typical story of schizophrenia. The beginning is, but the violent act police involvement is actually a rare presentation. So, which we'll get into more in a second here. But before we do that, let's take a break. What do you say, Berto?
Yes.
Just chiming in here, a reminder for everyone to go to Talkspace.com and use the promo code Kirk to get a discount if you're looking for online counseling. Online counseling is especially at Talkspace right now, it's a totally legit way of getting therapy. They only hire fully licensed therapists, meaning that they are not recent grads. They are fully licensed and they've been vetted. They've been trained in the online platform. And the cool thing about this Talkspace sort of format is you get contact with your therapist every day, which is, pretty cool. And so if you're looking for therapy or you just want to give it a try, go to Talkspace.com, use the promo code Kirk, which gives you a discount. Also, when you use the promo code Kirk, it also signals to Talkspace to let them know that this sponsorship is worth it. So we really want them to become an ongoing sponsor. So if you're interested and you just want to check it out, please do so now. Go to Talkspace.com, use the promo code Kirk. All right, we're back from the break. If you haven't become a patron of the podcast, please do so now. Go to patreon.com and become a patron of the podcast, because why should people become a patron, bro?
Well, lots of reasons. They first of all, they'll feel great about it because they'll be part of a community that's influencing our direction. There's a little bit of a family feeling to it too, and people will email us. We give priority to their emails when they can request topics for our show. They're also liable to get some swag here and there because you do all sorts of drawings. And also just a lot of their donations go to good causes. Yeah. And finally, they help us grow, and they help you produce the show and have more content, do more research, do really high quality episodes.
And we're very close to passing a Patreon goal in which we will start officially donating to petfinder.com. Petfinder.com finds pets. It's a huge organization of lots of people who volunteer. I got my pets through petfinder.com. There's all these people who volunteer their houses to foster animals so that they won't be euthanized somewhere else.
Yes,
and put them on the internet and connect them. And the people I got my cats from drove up, I think from like Arizona or something, like, because they were the foster home in Arizona, and they're like, and I found the two cats on the Pet Finder website, and I was like, I want these two cats. And then And then the owners said, well, we live in Arizona. Can you come down? Are you coming down here sometimes, or California or something? I was like, are you coming down here sometime soon? I'm like, no. And they're like, okay, road trip. And so they're a retired couple, and they just drove all the way up to Seattle.
That's insane.
And gave me my cats. Okay, so getting back to research regarding is serious mental illness associated with violence, and the answer is yes. But here's some major caveats. Number one. The vast majority of individuals with serious mental illness are not violent. So this is very important. Again, when I say the statement to the general public or people who don't understand statistics or risk factors or prevalence percentages, when I say that schizophrenia and other serious mental illnesses are associated with an increase in violence, what a lot of people hear is people with schizophrenia are violent.
Yeah. What you more mean, correct me if I'm wrong, it's more like if you took 100 people that are not diagnosed with a serious mental illness and you took 100 people that are diagnosed with a serious mental illness, the percentage of the latter group that would be likely to commit a crime would be slightly higher than the first group.
That's right. It's not slightly higher, but it's not. It's still a percentage, and we'll get more into statistics in a second. But anyway, a huge caveat is the vast majority of people with serious mental illness are not violent. So, even though there's a increase in risk, if you bump into someone with schizophrenia, the chance of them harming you is extremely low.
Yeah,
because most people are actually not violent, and most people with serious mental illness are not violent. Also, number two, another caveat: the vast majority of violence is committed by people who do not qualify for a serious mental illness. So when you actually, gather all the data on all the people in America, in the United States, who were violent this year, the vast majority of them were not seriously mentally ill. They were, they didn't have psychosis.
Because there's so many more people in that bucket.
Yeah. Number three. And also, violence is motivated by so many things.
Sure.
And it just so happens that psychosis can, for some individuals, kind of push them over the edge a little bit. Number three, people with serious mental illness are often victims of violence, and they're actually more likely to be a victim than they are to be a perpetrator. Because of our stupid society and our stigma around mental illness, there are people who will just target someone with a mental illness because they have a mental illness. They'll just like, well, you're a piece of shit, so I'm going to attack you, or no one's going to care if you're attacked, so I'm going to attack you. I mean, I remember hearing stories about people this is 20, 30 years ago. This homeless man who had schizophrenia was lit on fire in Seattle just because some roaming band of hicks came through Capitol Hill and decided that, I can't remember if it was Capitol Hill or downtown, but anyway, they're just like, let's go burn a homeless person,
Oh my.
Okay. So number four, another caveat. There are other factors that are much more predictive of violence other than schizophrenia and other mental illnesses. What do you think the other major indicators of a higher risk of violence are?
I would say socioeconomic background, maybe.
Maybe. That's not the one I have here.
Okay. Let me think.
There are three major factors that rise above all others, including socioeconomic.
Okay, if you're a male.
Yes. If you're a male, you are way more likely to commit a violent act than if you're a female.
You shouldn't say that. That's not right.
Yeah. So therefore, so if you're afraid of people with mental illness, then you should be way more afraid of men. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
What's another factor?
If you're okay, I mean, maybe this is dumb, but if you've previously committed a crime.
No. I mean, maybe, but in terms of demographics.
Oh, I see. Okay. Young, like early 20s.
Yeah, exactly. If you're a male aged 18 to 24 or 30-ish,
yeah,
you are, that group of people encapsulates like a vast majority of of any crime, let alone violent crime, mostly violent crime.
Right.
And what's the final factor? It's not demographic. It's
not demographic.
It's more, but it's broad. It's a huge category of thing.
Antisocial behavior.
No, alcohol use.
Oh, of course, substance.
Right. So if you're 25, if you see a 25-year-old male who has a beer in his hand, he has the markers of violence to such a degree that way higher than if you saw someone with schizophrenia walking down the road. Wow.
So a 20-year-old, even more so, because they're breaking the law already. So what else do they have to lose?
Yeah, right. So, and the fifth caveat here is that research is actually pretty difficult. So so even though I'm saying the gestalt of the research is that violence and schizophrenia and other psychotic major mental illnesses are related, it's hard to know to what degree, and even if that's accurate, because what constitutes a serious mental illness. Some of you might be surprised that for many people, it's hard to define whether or not someone actually has a mental illness or not. And so where's the line? What constitutes where's the line between not having schizophrenia and having schizophrenia? You have to define that line in the research somewhere. And
is there research about why male?
Yeah, they've tried to look at that. It's socialization, maybe hormones, maybe impulses, but definitely socialization. Because different societies have different gender breakdowns when it comes to this sort of thing. Anyway, so. Also, what constitutes a violent crime is spitting at someone. Is that a violent crime? Obviously, shooting someone's a violent crime. So where's that line exactly?
Sure.
Also, what gets reported? How many assaults or what would consider to be a criminal assault, how many of them actually are reported? I would say the vast majority are not. In fact, for me, I was completely assaulted a few years ago by what I assumed to be a psychotic person. I was walking out of 7-Eleven, or not the 7-Eleven, but the convenience store is right by my place downtown. Uh-huh. And this guy, I was just coming out of the door, and this guy, full swing, just hit me as hard as he could in the arm, in the shoulder. And ridiculous. It was so hard, I almost fell over. And I didn't report that.
Right.
So now, was he mentally ill? I don't know. But the point is how many assaults actually even are reported or even end up in the database that would allow for scrutiny by an outside researcher,
Oh, I got to tell you something that happened to me on an airplane recently. I was loading into the airplane, and ahead of me was a short gal. She was really short. She was like half my size, trying to get her bag up in the overhead.
And then you punched her in the face?
I punched her in the face. Felt awesome. And my testosterone level went up a little bit. Anyways, no, but I'm walking up, and I see that there's some sort of discussion happening between her and this dude. And the dude's got like an Australian accent maybe. He sounds like... I sometimes I'm really bad at accents that are not from here, but he's certainly not. He has some sort of United Kingdom accent. Okay, so he starts cussing at her like because she says like, I'm just trying to get my bag where like my row is. He's like, oh, like that's so fucking important.
Blimey, governor.
Yeah, exactly.
Why don't you go stick your face in the loo?
Yeah,
take a lift to hell.
Oh my gosh, wait, was it you? That was literally what. So, anyways, I'm hearing this and I don't really want to get involved, but at the same time, I'm like, it sounds like he's being a really big asshole. So I help her finish putting the bag in. And when he says like, oh yeah, like that's so fucking important, I say like, dude, she's just trying to put her bag where her seat is. And then he said, by this time he's sitting down and he's with his wife and kid, and his kid's like a toddler. And he says, I quote, I cannot believe he says this. He goes, he's like, what's it to you, sunshine? He literally said that line, which sounds like from an 80s movie or something. What's it to you, sunshine? And so I like for a second I wanted to burst out laughing because
what does that even mean?
So I get a little closer to him and I say, dude, calm down. Like that, because I was like, you're gonna get everyone kicked off this fucking plane, and we've been. Oh, by the way, the planes were delayed. We were all in a bad mood, and the guy then just like mumbles under his breath, like, you should sit down or something like that, right? Like, I couldn't quite make out what he said, and then that was the end of the drama. But I couldn't believe it. Like the guy was ready to throw down over the bag placement in the overhead compartment. It's crazy.
Yeah.
And then that line, who says that?
Yeah. You should have been like,
to ya,
you
sunshine?
should be like, how did you know my name? I'm Sunshine McGee.
Oh my gosh.
Now, having said that, he probably wasn't mentally ill.
No, he didn't seem, he just seemed, well, who knows? But he seemed highly stressed out and, sorry for the diagnosis, an asshole.
Well, and in my experience, traumatized. People who have been traumatized, bullied, physically abused can easily be triggered in a context like that.
I didn't think that.
Yeah,
I didn't take that into account.
Well, it's helpful to me and maybe to you and to you deserving listeners out there. Whenever you see behavior like that, I have come to learn very clearly that these people have been traumatized. When your dad beats you and your nerves are fried and you walk around in a constant state of hypervigilance of threat.
Oh.
And if someone is in your space, or you've had your flight delayed and you've had a customer service agent tell you to sit the fuck down or something, they wouldn't say that, but they go, sit down, get on my, and you're just getting triggered, and your distress level is at an 8, and then someone is at the final moment, in your space and annoying you, you just see red. It's road rage. It'd be the same as if you take a woman who has been sexually abused her whole childhood, and then a big man walks up to her in public and says, "Hey, baby, you're looking good."
Right.
And then she's triggered and she goes into this very distressing state.
Right.
And has a panic attack and runs to the bathroom and cries for 2 hours. It's the exact same brain phenomenon. That's
very fascinating. I did not actually consider. I don't know why that seems so obvious now that I think about it. I wonder actually. Because I also was curious why the thing I said to him seemed to bring him down to a calmer level, even though he was still mumbling under his breath.
Yeah.
Because that reaction and that statement of like, "What's it to you, sunshine?" is such an aggressive like thing, right? And then when I looked at him, I sort of frowned and I said like, "Dude, calm down," right? But that wasn't "Oh yeah, let's show," but it was more like, "Can you come back to reality," right?
Yeah.
And that seemed to be that plus his wife going like, "Dude, stop."
Yeah.
What seemed to be just enough. Now he still mumbled something, but that was like the end of it, right?
Yeah, I mean, he probably saw you as someone who could throw down, and plus you're standing, he's sitting, he's with his wife,
and he wasn't a big guy either.
Yeah.
Like he was a.
But I just speculating.
Yeah.
If he was triggered, my guess is he was thinking, this could end badly for me. Me yelling at some woman,
right?
I could probably just go off on that and be okay. But this guy who,
I see. That's a good point, because he was yelling. He was abusing someone like half his size,
right.
with no power.
Having said that, there's being triggered doesn't make you psychotic. It just makes you extremely distressed. All of us have been there.
Yeah.
I mean, how many of us have yelled at someone in the car? That's because we were distressed and we're letting it out. Anyway. Okay, so before going into the research, I just want to also talk a little bit about the political dogma and misinformation that is being propagated in our society. There's two sides. So you have people who are in my field who are trying to propagate this idea that there is no association between serious mental illness and violence. They are against the stigma, but there's plenty of people who know, I think, better and are just making super false claims as a shortcut to try to tell people that people with serious mental illness are not at a risk. And so, for example, different quotes that I have here that I pulled from various different professionals. Quote, "People living with mental illness are no more violent than other people," unquote. That's just like not supported. Now, they might be saying mental disorders, in which case, if you just lump every mental disorder together, my guess is that you wouldn't see a significant difference because again, 50% of Americans will have a mental disorder at some point in their life. So, and what's the chance that 50% is more violent than the other 50%? It's a pretty slim chance. Quote, "Research consistently shows there is no evidence that people living with mental illness are generally more violent than anyone else," unquote. Now, there's a tricky word. So generally more violent. So what does that exactly mean, right? Like, yeah, you could say that. Like, well, they are a little more violent. They're a little bit more likely to be violent. But the general person with a mental disorder is not more likely to be violent, So it's a bit of a play with words.
Yeah.
Another quote here. "The causal link between psychosis and violence is inconclusive," they'll say. They'll say it's inconclusive. It's actually, unfortunately, I hate to say this because of the stigma, but it actually, there's a ton of evidence pointing at psychosis as being, as raising the risk. Again, caveat, the chance of a particular psychotic person being violent is extremely low. But then you have people on the other side where the media is super biased. Whenever in the news someone commits some kind of heinous violent act, immediately it's assumed that there must be a mental illness, when in reality, the chance that any one person who commits a terrible act, the chance that they actually do have a serious mental illness is extremely low, actually. Yeah. Okay. So again, in a nutshell, unfortunately, there appears to be a relationship between serious mental illness and violent behavior.
Oh, quick question.
Yeah.
Because definitely, like with a lot of the mass shootings, a lot of the rhetoric is sometimes like, don't talk about guns, don't talk about anything. We should just talk about mental illness.
Right.
We
should be talking about both.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I was just wondering, like, in general, a lot of those end up being inconclusive as well. Like, well, he was a little depressed, or he was doing this.
Well, take for instance the kid who killed all those kids in New Haven, Connecticut. He was on the spectrum. He was high functioning autistic, but no, from what I can tell, noticeably autistic. So he wasn't like imperceptibly autistic, if that makes any sense. But he was higher functioning, as they call them, and he committed all those heinous acts. And a lot of people's gestalt after all the news reports and everything was, because he was autistic, he committed all those terrible acts.
Right.
But his autism had nothing to do with it.
Right.
Because out of the millions of Americans who are on the spectrum, hardly any of them commit any, the chance of an autistic person committing a crime is the same as a non-autistic committing a crime like that.
That's not a serious mental illness.
Right. Well, even if it was, the point is that the kids at Columbine, they didn't have autism.
Right.
So it's like there's this witch hunt whenever there's a news story like this of like, well, what's the mental illness? And then there's this confirmation bias that when you actually find it, you're like, oh, that's it. You know what I mean? Plus, again, it's a human compulsion to want to explain things, and a human compulsion to want to say, well, I need an answer that is satisfying to me. Yeah. Like, well, he's a Muslim, so therefore all we have to do is keep Muslims out of the country. Oh, that person's a mental illness. Okay, all I have to do is make sure that I keep mental illness people at arm's length. Oh, okay, that person is that, so I can protect. The fact is I hate to break it to people, there's no way to protect yourself from these kinds of crimes other than don't think about it, because it's not going to happen to you. Yeah. Again, the lottery of one of these killing sprees affecting you, or one of these run-over stories happening to you, is so low. In fact, the tiny bit of stress that takes probably like a few weeks off of your life is actually more damaging to you than actually what would actually happen to you. Now, does that mean that it doesn't happen? No, it happens. It happens. But the statistic I always like to bring up is something like 20 to 30,000 Americans die from the flu every year.
Yeah,
the flu. more people have died from like 10, 100, like, I don't know, how many people died from terrorism this last year?
Yeah.
And what percentage of that compares to, how does that compare to the people that,
And when you go to cars or heart disease, or it's a ridiculous comparison.
Right. So, what are we consumed by when we walk down the street as we're not washing our hands, as we're eating a burger, as we're driving a car, literally driving a car with a burger with a hand that we didn't wash after touching that doorknob? Like, you are a billion times more at risk than you will ever be from a Muslim,
right?
or someone with a mental illness. You know what I mean?
I think it's this natural feeling of like we want things to be fair, and already some things feel unfair. Like, God, I can't believe there are diseases that could kill us. But something like cars, we all look at it and like, yeah, that sucks that there's so many car crashes. But I'm a pretty good driver, so I'll be fine.
Right.
Whereas like, wait, someone just randomly walked into a mall and killed 20 people?
Yeah.
Well, that's not fair, dude. And that could happen to anyone.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Which is, it's true that it's not fair, and it could technically happen to anyone, but the odds are, like you're saying, really low.
Right. And if you want to increase your safe living, there are so many other things you should be thinking about other than norovirus. Okay. So, to be specific, again, lots of studies, but here's my Gestalt average, is the risk of violence for schizophrenia, for bipolar, or any other psychotic disorder is anywhere from between 3 to 10 times more likely to commit a violent act.
Okay.
So, it's pretty high.
But what's the percentage?
Which we'll get to in a second.
Okay.
But so, if you don't have a schizophrenia, bipolar, psychosis, you're at a certain rate of or likelihood of committing violence. If you have schizophrenia, bipolar, psychosis, you're somewhere between 3 to 10 times more likely to commit a violent act.
Which is quite significant.
That's significant. We're not talking like 1.3. We're talking like three. The low end is 3 times more likely. That's a signal in the data.
Right.
So,
like, to put it in perspective, if the percentage of quote unquote normal people that committed crimes was 10%, that would mean up to 100%
right.
of the other folks.
So let's do an thought exercise. Berto, what percentage likelihood are you, Berto, going to commit a violent act in the next month? Give me
pretty high, 99%.
If you have to go to a 0.0, like, actually give me a percentage.
All right. Well, because in my mind, the only chance of that happening is if something horrible happened to me that made me lose control of my emotions, and that would trigger me in some weird way. So I'm going to go really low, like 0.001%.
Yeah, it's probably even lower than that, honestly, because like out of all the months that you've lived in your life, how many times in your life have you actually committed a violent act on someone that wasn't even close to self-defense?
Well, when I was in NAM, but that's different.
Yeah. So, okay, so we'll go 0.001, you said. Okay. So if you times that by the upper end of 10 times, you now have a 0.01% chance of... So you compared to someone with schizophrenia. So the average person is extremely unlikely to commit a violent act in any time soon. And when you times that extremely low likelihood by 10, you're still at a very, very low number.
Yeah.
So the vast majority... So again... putting statistics into real life. Other statistics here accounts for so serious mental illness, according to some research, accounts for anywhere between 5 to 15% of violent crimes.
Okay,
so that's a pretty big deal, right?
Yeah.
Now, this is proportionally higher to the amount of people in our society who actually suffer from serious mental illness. But serious mental illness, the prevalence is, it's not small. So,
but that's still surprisingly low, considering that if it was 10 times greater, or up to 10 times greater likelihood of causing it, but it only accounts for up to 15%. That means that there's all those other reasons that people are committing crimes.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So another statistic here is Within 5 years of first being diagnosed, 11% of men and 3% of women have been convicted of a violent offense. So this is just looking at convictions. And this is 7 times higher than those in the general population. So within the first 5 years of being diagnosed with a serious mental illness like schizophrenia, 11% of men are convicted of a violent crime. Okay. You know, it's a pretty significant figure there, right? And 3% of women. And actually the 3% of women is extremely higher than the average woman of a violent crime, because the women are extremely unlikely to commit a violent crime. So the fact that 3% of those with schizophrenia, women, within 5 years of first being diagnosed, are convicted of violence. We're not talking about committing a violent. We're talking actually, you know, so when you're convicted of a violent offense, there's likelihood there were other violent acts. You know what I mean? So
the worst thing you can do is encounter a 20-year-old male who's drinking heavily and has a severe mental illness, and it's a full moon.
Yeah. And also these studies accounted for context, you know, because sometimes your context can create mental illness, and also your context can create violence.
But if you wear glasses, you're fine?
Yeah. Right. Good joke. 5 times, I won't go into that, but anyway, they accounted for that variable. Okay, final little study here. People who are close to this psychotic person are at a higher risk of being harmed. As I said earlier, 87% of the time, family members or friends or people who live in the home with the person with psychosis are the victim of the violence.
Wow, that's sorry to use the word crazy. That's insane. That's sad, right? Because these are the people trying to help,
right? And
of course, they end up being affected.
So again, another bit of context there, that if you don't have someone with psychosis living in your house, the chance of you being the victim of a violent crime by someone with a mental illness is extremely low. So when you're walking on the street and you're at Pike Place and you see someone screaming, the chance that they're going to turn on you is extremely low.
Right.
Having lived downtown for a number of years, I would see these folks and became extremely calm around them. Right. I'd be like, oh, that person, I'd walk right next to them and nothing would happen, because the chance that anyone is violent is low. Yeah. And the chance that someone with schizophrenia would attack you is also extremely low. The thing that I would tell myself is, if this person's tendency is to randomly attack strangers that walk by them on the sidewalk, they would already be they would already be locked up. I mean, what's the chance that
today is the day it starts?
Right. Yeah. So, and another thought I would have is, well, you know, at least they have an outlet. You know, they're screaming it. It's like it's a way for them to get it out. You know, if all of us did that, maybe the world would be a better place. Okay. So again, the statistic you just really want to focus on is the risk of violence for schizophrenia, bipolar psychosis is anywhere between 3 to 10 times higher than for those without that. But that still means it's extremely low likelihood that anyone with schizophrenia, psychosis, bipolar will actually commit a violent crime. Again, number one, the vast majority of individuals with serious mental illness are not violent. Number two, the vast majority of violence is committed by people who do not qualify for a mental illness. So if you really want to be afraid of violence, target people without mental illness.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Is there a split by sex of severe mental illness? Like, is there a significant difference between the sexes?
Yes, I think there's a slight male tendency, but I think it's basically 50-50.
I see. Okay.
But don't quote me on that. So let's just say it's 50-50, because that's what's in my head. That's what feels right to me. So I guess what I should say is I don't know, Berto. That's a good question. I should look that up. Number three, people with serious mental illness are more likely to be victims of violence than they are to commit it. Number four, there are other factors that are much more predictive of violence, such as being young, being male, and using alcohol or drugs. What's the percentage, Berto, of violent crimes in the U.S. committed by males? Don't answer that yet. Let's take a break, and then when we get back, we'll talk about that. Hey, everyone. Today's episode is brought to you by Talkspace. Talkspace is a super legit online counseling outfit that I fully endorse. I know what they are up to and have looked into their practices to make sure that I am, promoting something that I believe in, and I do believe in it. I'm pretty close with someone who actually works there, Shannon McFarland. She trains the therapists. So if you're looking for online counseling, and or you just want to experiment with it, you just want to see what it's all about, go to Talkspace.com, use the promo code Kirk. You have to use that promo code, one, to get your discount, and also to let them know that this advertisement worked, which means that they'll pay for more ads to be in this podcast, which means that I can spend more time in this podcast, which means I can do more deep dives, which I've been having a lot of fun with lately. So again, go to Talkspace.com, use the promo code Kirk, and you will, I think, be set up with a therapist pretty quickly. I think that's pretty cool. So do that now, if you're interested. All right, we're back from the break. Berto, as I asked you before the break, what's the percentage of violent crimes in the U.S. committed by males?
I answered during the break. You didn't hear me? All right. Okay. It's percentage of violent crimes committed by males in the U.S. is 60%.
No, 80%.
80%?
80%. Yeah. There's two surprising bits to that for me personally. One is like, holy crap, come on, guys, knock it off. But two, it's like 20% of violent crimes are committed by women.
That's true, yeah.
1 out of 5 violent crimes are committed by women. And in my head, because of the media and movies and everything, I have almost no visual of what that looks like.
Right.
Because it's just not, it just doesn't, it's when I think of someone punching someone, when I think of someone shooting someone, when I think of someone knifing someone, when I think of someone kicking someone, I can only picture in my head a man doing those things.
Right.
You know what I mean? But 1 out of 5 times, it's a woman. Anyway.
That is true. That's...
Number 5, caveat, the risk of violence is not associated with the vast majority of other disorders of the DSM, like anxiety, depression, etc. Okay, so serious mental illness just raises the risk. For example, as we've been talking about, most of the time when you drive to work, you don't die in a car accident, right? So
I think so.
Yeah. When you drive to work or when you're driving to the store, the vast majority of the time, you do not die.
That's right.
Right?
Mostly, yeah.
And
Mostly.
When you get in your car, you're not like, holy shit, I have a 50% chance of being killed in my car today.
Correct.
Right? You're just like, I'm just driving to work. You don't even think about it. But your risk of dying, and if you do get in a car, is vastly higher than if you don't drive a car. If you have a job in which you never have to drive and you live 1 block from your store and you never drive, or you take the bus everywhere, the chance of you dying in a car accident is extremely low.
Right.
People who commute to work have, I don't know what the stat is, but let's say at least 10 times more likely to die in a car accident.
Yeah.
But does that mean you don't drive a car to work?
Right.
So in the same way, even though people with serious mental illness are 3 to 10 times more likely to commit a violent act, does that mean you don't walk past that person who has schizophrenia when you're downtown? Or does that mean the schizophrenic person that you know in your family, does that mean you completely avoid them because they're going to kill you? No, it's actually a more ridiculous question than the driving thing.
What if they're driving... They're 20-year-old male drunk driving with severe mental illness, and you're their relative, their closest relative.
The universe collapses in on itself. Also, another thing here is another stat that's kind of just to put fun with statistics, is when you drink alcohol, you are much more likely to become violent based on statistics. So, for instance, according to one study, of the homicide offenders that in the United States who killed someone for any reason, not manslaughter, or no, homicide includes murder and manslaughter. So any manslaughter or murder.
Okay, so like premeditated, really mean, or also like, okay, I killed this person because I did something negligent.
Right.
Yeah.
Or self-defense, or I suddenly saw him in my house and shot him or something. Right. Okay, so what percentage were drinking alcohol at the time?
Oh, interesting. I'm going to go with 30%.
Yeah, because like how many people are drinking at any given time, do you think? Right?
Right.
So like 5% or 3% of people.
Alcohol is pretty pervasive, but yeah.
But I mean, people go to work.
Right.
They sleep. So, 30%, that'd be pretty high, right? Because you're just like, well, if you're going from 5% of people are drinking at any given time and 30% of people
it's a lot
who kill
higher
people, it's a lot higher. It's 86% of homicide offenders were drinking at the time.
Wow.
Yeah. 86%.
But pot's illegal in a lot of places.
Yes.
Wow.
Another statistic, and again, 86 probably high, but one, study found that another 42% of violent crimes.
Oh my
so
God.
this includes not just homicide, but any violent crime reported to the police involved alcohol, meaning that alcohol was in the police report.
I mean, that's crazy. Like, I'm not for banning things, but that's crazy that if you removed it, you get rid of 86% of the violent or the homicides.
Yeah. Anyone, and I've been saying this for years, anyone who's against pot being legal needs to really look at themselves in the mirror when it comes to alcohol.
Oh, yeah.
Because alcohol has so many ill effects on society.
Yeah. Like, well, you always gotta do if you're talking about health, you gotta look at cigarettes. If you're talking about like ill effects overall, you gotta look at alcohol.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Full disclosure, Berto and I don't use cannabis, but we do drink alcohol.
Hey, I eat magic cookies. Don't forget.
On accident. Listen to that episode. But anyway, so yeah, alcohol, it's much more likely to be a factor in violence. So again, just to compare, if you're afraid of someone with schizophrenia, then you should be 1 billion times more afraid of anyone who drinks alcohol.
Yes.
But again, just getting to the statistics, fun with statistics, what's the chance that any one person who drinks a drink of alcohol is going to commit a violent act?
Yeah, it's still low.
It's very low. Yeah. But the risk goes up. So if you, so let's just take you.
Yeah.
Berto, you had a 0.001% chance of committing a violent act in the next month. If we make you drink every day, your chance might go up to 0.05 or something. And still you're extremely not likely. If you roll the dice on that bet, you want to bet on he's not going to commit a violent act but he's much more likely. Okay.
So attending a frat party is very dangerous from what I'm hearing.
Also, correlation doesn't indicate causation. That's another point here. What do you think I might say when I get into this talk here?
Well, usually individuals, first of all, you can't judge an individual from the stats to start with. But second, it might be that the crimes committed happen to, you're looking at, did this person have some serious mental illness and did they commit a crime? And those two might come out to yes, but it might not be because of the mental illness. It might be because of the stigma. It might be because of their family dynamics. It might be because of any number of other things.
Exactly. If you have schizophrenia, how does society treat you?
Poorly.
Bad. How does your family treat you?
Probably very difficult.
How does the medical system, how does the legal system, how does medical, how do friends, how does society, how does the media, like you are being treated like shit.
Yeah.
So let's imagine a world in which we didn't do that. Would those numbers go down? I would say, yeah. I mean, if you have schizophrenia and everyone continues to love you and there's systems in place and there's support for the family and there's ways of really wrapping around the person and being there for them, what's the chance that that person is going to become perturbed to the point where, because we tend to be very linear idiots, we're like mental illness, violence, mental illness causes violence, instead of looking systemically and saying like, well, what's the context that mental illness and violence exists in? And looking at how other systemic factors might play a role, such as the way we treat people with mental illness.
Well, for example, since part of the stat is that most often the victims of the crime or whatever are family members, that right there might be one of the biggest problems, is that we're having family members take care of severely mentally ill people when they have no capability or training or financial or whatever to do so.
Exactly. Also, another factor that might cause, when we talk about correlation doesn't equal causation, what we're saying is that these things are correlated, but they might not cause each other, and there might be another factor that is causing both of them.
Yeah.
So, for instance, trauma can result in a lot of different things, including mental illness and including violence, right? If you're traumatized, you're much more likely to develop any sort of disorder in addition to any sort of psychosis. And I would imagine that past trauma, violent trauma, is related to an increased incidence of violence as well. So the real factor might be trauma, not mental illness. That seems to be a very compelling hypothesis,
Although someone could say that if you could find that there's a high correlation between trauma and mental illness and between trauma and violence, then you can still use it as a marker for predicting the 3 to 10% greater.
Yes, and when we look at people, so say there's someone who has schizophrenia who commits a violent act, the question shouldn't be like, how did schizophrenia cause the act? We should say, how did trauma affect?
Sure.
It's crazy. The trauma had another effect, which happened to be schizophrenia.
Yeah.
Whenever there's a violent crime, I often think, was that person traumatized? In the same way we were talking about the road rage or that dude on the airplane. Yeah, it's always like, what PTSD are they suffering from? Officer Yanez, the Philando Castile murderer, that officer clearly suffered from PTSD. When we talked about that on that episode, did you get a chance to listen to the audio that was released after?
Yes, I did.
And his audio?
Yep.
And he's like, so did you hear him panting?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So in the last episode that we did about Philando Castile, I had been listening to the podcast 74 Seconds. And by that point, I had only heard the audio of a different call that had nothing to do with Philando Castile. It was like a month or several weeks before the Philando Castile moment, in which he almost got ran over by a car.
Right.
And for like 20 minutes or something, at least 15 minutes or something, you can hear him on the audio that's captured on the dash cam, just him going,
right. He couldn't calm down.
I'm going to cough, just trying to, yeah. And his fellow officers, you can hear them coming up to him going like, are you going to be okay? Like, and he's like, yeah. Like imagine breathing like that for 50, that's not Officer Yanez's fault. The man has been traumatized at some point, either on the police force or other. I would suspect actually otherwise. And he has a brain pathway that kicks in when there is threat.
Yep.
And when Philando had said, "I have a gun," his PTSD kicked in. I can say this fairly certainly based on, because I've really looked into this whole thing. Because Yanez wasn't a bad person. Nope. He wasn't like a known racist.
His voice did not sound threatening, and his demeanor, like every indication was that what he was saying was what he meant, which is, hey, I'm letting you know I've got a gun. Da, 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 da.
Right.
As opposed to like, I've got a gun.
Right.
I'm gonna use it.
And Yanez has, I think, no notion of like, I'm going to go kill black people today, or I'm going to go beat some black people today. It had purely to do with his trauma. Now, does race play a role in all this? Yeah, because your threat, if you have bias, implicit bias against black people, you're going to feel more threatened by black people.
But it wasn't a conscious decision of like, oh, I see. Okay,
and it was so fast. Yeah. I mean, it's like, he's like, sir, I have to tell you I have a gun. And he's like, okay, well, don't take it out. And then he's like reaching for his wallet and he's like, don't take it. Boom, 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 boom.
Yeah, it was, that was one thing that was surprising, because when we talked about it, I hadn't heard that part. And afterwards, I was like, wait a minute, that happened in 2 seconds.
Yeah. Well, in that episode, only had a description from the prosecutor that I was relaying. And then the next 10 or 20 minutes, Officer Yanez is going,
it's back to that.
Yeah. And so again, trauma is the cause is a better cause in my mind to violence. If we're going to look at mental conditions that can lead to unnecessary violence,
Right.
I would look to trauma more than I would look to schizophrenia.
Yeah. And unfortunately, you could have imagined an outcome where they said, okay, we've consulted with expert, psychiatrists, psychologists, and everything. And it turns out, it looks like the police force never diagnosed or treated Mr. Yanis for what's obviously, this, that, and the other thing. So we're going to fine the police force N amount. And next time they have to, have better programs in place. You could have imagined an outcome along those lines. And instead, sadly, it was just nope, there's no guilt. It's over.
Right. And the dominant discourse, which is a good discourse to have, is racism,
right?
And Black Lives Matter, and blah blah blah, which is relevant because of the implicit bias that everyone has. In America.
And there's been so many deaths and all these things.
Totally. But the even notion that Officer Yanez had PTSD, which is so obvious to me. I mean, of course, I can't diagnose him, but he has some sort of traumatic reaction. The fact that is completely not even on anyone's radar.
And now it's not a forcing function on that police force or any police force to say, ooh, okay, we better devote some money to making sure we do treat these things.
Because that, to me, would capture probably a good number of these shootings. Because whenever I've seen a number of these shootings on the internet, and a lot of them seem like the officer is going blank. They're just they're scared, and the more scared you are and the more traumatized you are, the more you're gonna have a behavior that you regret later. Because I bet you Yanez totally regrets having done all that stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway, also alcohol. When you mix alcohol with psychosis, you're even more likely to commit a crime.
Can imagine.
But again, very low likelihood that any individual is drinking with psychosis to commit a crime, but it does raise the risk to some extent. And some of the research would say, like, it's not schizophrenia, it's alcohol, but the broader research consensus is that it's both.
I see.
So some people are like saying, it's not schizophrenia, it's alcohol. And then it's like, well, actually, when you look at it, it's both. Okay. So again, the risk of violence is anywhere between 3 to 10 times higher for those with serious mental illness like schizophrenia and serious bipolar and other psychotic disorders. And the problem is not people with mental disorders. The problem is potentially trauma. So how can we reduce, if we really want to address this, how can we reduce trauma for children? But the other thing here that we haven't talked about is proper treatment. Most acts of violence committed by individuals with serious mental illness are carried out when they are not being treated. So think about that.
Yeah.
So you have however tens of thousands, millions of people with schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. The ones that are not being treated are the ones who are very likely to commit violent acts. So again, it's not the mental illness.
Right.
It's the things that happen to you from being isolated and alone and no one is there to help, and the desperation that might start to kick in, or the symptoms that spin out of control.
Well, I wonder if that's somewhere where socioeconomic does play a role, because I would imagine people with lower resources don't have access. Well, first of all, may not even consider the idea of, like, oh, I think we need to go to therapy, like send this person to therapy or send them to get diagnosed, all these things. And plus, they might not have the money or the insurance or whatever.
Absolutely. Some research shows that when people with a serious mental illness are receiving effective treatment, they are no more likely to commit a violent act than anyone else. That's not necessarily the consensus, but there's some studies that show that, look, if you have a serious mental illness and you're getting properly treated, you're actually no more likely to commit a violent act. So it's not the psychosis that's the problem. It's the fact that our society is so stupid and doesn't allocate the funds.
Right.
It's our fault. So the main factors are, when you're talking about actual individuals with psychosis in the proper treatment realm, is making sure that they are aware of their issue, making sure that you have an early intervention, because a lot of the violent acts occur in that first episodic period before they get treatment and before they even know that they have a problem. So it becomes very important that there's awareness in general in our society, so that family members and even individuals will know to reach out and know where to go, and that there are services that will kick in very, very quickly.
It's probably pretty common that they go ahead and commit that first act of violence and then they start getting treatment.
Right. So conclusion. Severe mental illness seems to be a risk factor in violent behavior for mainly psychotic disorders.
Right.
But the overall chance that someone with mental illness will harm you is extremely low. Like I said, you're much more likely to die in a car accident than you are to be harmed by someone with mental illness and that kind of stuff. Most killing sprees are committed by people without a serious mental illness. Most violent acts are committed by people without a serious mental illness. So the other thing that I want to really just put a fine point on is that we are to blame for this problem.
Right.
The serious mental illness risk factor can be almost potentially completely mitigated, if not mostly mitigated, by reducing stigma, increasing access to treatment, increasing the effectiveness of treatment, increasing compliance with treatment. And these efforts are of awareness and increasing treatment. These efforts are hindered by the stereotype that psychotic people are violent.
Yeah.
The notion that psychotic people are violent creates this vicious cycle that stigmatizes it and keeps us stupid and unaware of what we should be doing, so we don't do anything, which leaves people untreated. And we sort of ostracize them and marginalize them in society, which they don't get access to treatment, which makes them more likely to commit a violent crime. And every time that happens, we highlight it in the news, which causes more stigma and blah, 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 blah.
Yep.
So we're all culpable of that. So when you encounter someone with a mental illness, try not to worry, because it's extremely unlikely that they're going to be dangerous. And there are many other things you should be worrying about, like washing your hands during flu season. And let's all do what we can to reduce stigma of mental illness. Again, 50% of Americans will qualify for a disorder at some point in their life. Having a mental illness is... so I was trying to think of what other thing half of Americans have or do or something.
Penis.
Yeah. Well, what's another thing?
Well, maybe getting a divorce.
No, I think it's a little lower than
50%?
50% of, well, anyway, wearing...
But that's not even all Americans, because they don't all get married either.
Right.
So.
Wearing lenses.
Oh, yeah.
So wearing glasses. About half of Americans wear contacts or need some sort of corrective lens to live in the world.
Yeah.
And so how many people do you know wear glasses or contacts?
I wear contacts.
I wear contacts.
Yeah.
That's as many people, that's a rough estimate of the amount of people that you also know that will suffer from a mental disorder at some point in their life.
Yikes. Yeah.
So it's the rule, not the exception.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let us know what you think. If you want, you can contact us by emailing us at contact@psychologyinseattle.com. Again, go to patreon.com, become a patron of the podcast. And everyone, please take care of yourself, because
you deserve it.
Hey, deserving listeners, today's episode is brought to you by Talkspace, which is an online counseling outfit that I fully endorse. I've looked into their practices and really wanted to make sure that I was promoting something that I can get behind, and I can definitely get behind this online counseling service. They make sure that their therapists are fully licensed. They train them in online counseling. The price is pretty affordable and reasonable. If you use the promo code Kirk, you actually get a discount. Also, when you use the promo code Kirk, it signals to Talkspace that this advertisement works, which means that they'll want to sponsor more episodes, which means that everyone wins. So if you're interested in online counseling, or if you're just looking for someone to chat with every day, because this is on Talkspace, you get contact with your therapist every day, which is pretty cool, right? So go to Talkspace, use the promo code Kirk, and get your discount, and start your online counseling experience today. Do it if you're interested. I think it's pretty cool. If you're on the fence, again, just give it a try and see if it's for you. Maybe it's not for you, but if it is for you, I think it's a pretty cool service, pretty convenient. You can do it
from anywhere, right? And again, you have contact with your therapist every day. Pretty cool. All right, end of commercial.